PhD at the University of Trento in Italy and postdoc at Otto von Guericke in Germany. And so we're very lucky that when she chose to set up her own lab, she came to the UK to do so. She's now at the University of Liverpool, where she's pursued a very exciting program of research on mental imagery and anomalous perceptual experience. So over to you. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. So who has ever seen or heard of a hypno bucket? Raise your hand. A few people, some people who tried it out today. So this is actually one of the Ganzflicker demos that I showcased at an exhibition last November, a museum exhibition where people could try out different ways of eliciting pseudo-hallucinations using visual flicker. And if you'd like, after the talk, you can come and try out the hypno bucket for yourself and see if you see anything at all, or if you see something very cool. You'll see some of the experiences that people have. I've written some of them down. So yeah, hopefully you won't be too biased or too disappointed if you don't see the most extreme things. But everybody should see something. So try it out after, it should be cool. But Ganzflicker is not just for fun. I think it could also be a psychedelic simulator. It could be a hallucination simulator. And I think we could potentially use it to predict whether someone is going to develop complex hallucinations if they were to experience some kind of psychiatric disorder. I just want to preface this by saying I don't think that people who experience different things in Ganzflicker are more prone to develop psychiatric conditions. I don't think that's related at all. It's more like I think it could be used to predict whether people will have sensory experiences if they develop psychiatric disorders. So just keep that in mind as I talk about this. All of the work that I've done has not been in patients. It's only been in general population. Using pseudo-hallucinations to sort of simulate hallucinations. So the main problem that I kind of want to figure out is why people experience different things. And divergent experiences, perceptual experiences can be very extreme. One of the most extreme forms of divergent perception is complex hallucinations, which can occur in various psychiatric disorders, also age-related macular degeneration, under the influence of certain drugs, for example. There are other forms of divergent perception that have been investigated, such as synesthesia, which is the uncontrollable association between two different experiences or sensations. One real sensation can trigger the illusory experience of another, such as grapheme color synesthesia in this case. And then something else that my collaborators and I are also sort of looking into is mental projection, or what we call prophantasia, which is the voluntary ability to project mental images into the real world. So the relationship between all of these divergent experiences is not so clear-cut. So there are those who say that because complex experiences are involuntary and uncontrollable, they're experienced externally in the environment, in the real environment, and they're often reported as vivid as real life. That's why they're confused with reality, some people say. However, these other conditions or experiences can also be involuntary in the case of synesthesia. They can be experienced external or internal. They're as vivid as real life, but they're not confused with reality. So I think there is this extra dimension of reality discrimination that we always have to keep in mind when we're looking into why some people experience complex hallucinations and others don't. And I think mental imagery might have something to do with this. So that started my exploration in imagery extremes. So as we know now, since about 2015, there is a spectrum of visual mental imagery from a completely blind mind's eye to extremely vivid mind's eye. And these extremes are called aphantasia and hyperphantasia. And these are the groups that I'm going to focus on for this talk. So lots of previous research has suggested that people with imagery, particularly vivid imagery, tend to experience divergent things like synesthesia. They might be more likely to have schizophrenia symptoms. So I was really interested in this relationship between mental imagery and these divergent experiences. So I wanted to know, how does imagery impact perception in the real world? My hypothesis was that stronger imagery would lead to a stronger reliance on imagery for perception, which would lead to a higher proneness to divergent experiences such as pareidolia. So we did a project back in 2019 where we asked people to look for faces in visual noise, Gaussian noise, and people would see all kinds of faces. Just because we asked them to look for faces, they would see faces. But this is not a very robust effect. When we put people into the MRI scanner and showed them the Gaussian noise, after they kind of found out that there were actually no faces presented in the noise, they stopped seeing things. So this was not a super reliable effect. So then we looked into eliciting pseudo-hallucinations. And there are various ways that you can elicit pseudo-hallucinations, and they are different from pareidolia. The way that I define them is that they are subjective. They don't have a stereotype sort of reliability across subjects. So like not everybody sees the same thing. They can be simple or complex, very much like hallucinations on drugs, for example. So that's why I call these pseudo-hallucinations. Pareidolia is something else. So one of the ways that you can induce pseudo-hallucination is through sensory deprivation. And yes, that's me. I blindfolded myself for 3 straight days to try and experience hallucinations. It actually didn't work for me. I didn't see anything for 3 days, but it was fun wandering around and trying to get by. My sister helped me out. But there is a study that came out in 2004 from a lab in Harvard that found that if after about 24 hours, about 70% of people start to experience complex hallucinations. But that's not really practical for a lab experiment. So I also tried out uniform Ganzfeld, which is just a clear luminant field. It can be of any color, but as people just stare at straight luminance across the entire visual field, they can start to experience visuals that seem to be like hallucinations. This usually takes about 10 to 15 minutes. So it's also not that great for an experiment. It wastes precious time paying participants, but a lot of people are susceptible to these kinds of pseudo-hallucinations. However, we found that the most efficient and effective method of eliciting pseudo-hallucinations was Ganzflicker, which is just the alternation of 2 Ganzfelds. And once you start to flicker the Ganzfelds, people can start to experience very intense visuals within a few seconds, usually within a minute or so. So that is the paradigm that we decided to go with to investigate pseudo-hallucinations. And like I said before, I was really interested in this difference between people with different imagery abilities. So I created a 10-minute Ganzflicker study where people would just watch the Ganzflicker and then rate their experiences with various discrete choices about the features of things that they might have seen. So at first I asked people, did you see anything at all? And then if they said yes, they would rate how vivid it was, how complex it was, how long it took for the experiences to emerge, how often they occurred, how long a single one tended to last. And we gave this questionnaire and Ganzflicker task to people with aphantasia from Reddit. And then we also posted on the hyperphantasia subreddit. And then we also gave the questionnaire to a group of students from University for a total sample size in our first study of 204 participants across the mental imagery spectrum. And we also asked people to describe as much as they could remember about what they saw after they filled out the questionnaire. So here are some of the examples of simple things that people saw in Ganzflicker. So some people saw lots of shifting motion, different geometric shapes moving around the screen, lines changing into small squares, swirls, ghost-like tulips, balls of light, flashing yellow, mainly lines. Those tend to be pretty typical things that people see in Ganzflicker. About 90% of people see that. And then there are these sort of inexplicable experiences that people have where they say they see extremely complex scenes that might even have a kind of story to them. So I'm not going to read this whole thing, but I'll read a bit of it. First, a landscape looking over a cliff from a mountain onto a valley, more mountains in the background with lots of trees. This persisted quite a while. Then long spider legs spiraling into the image, consuming it. Then the galaxy edge on, sometimes rotating upwards, mainly of space. Then it would all go blank. This happened several times. It goes on and on and on, like very complex sort of experiences. So then we also asked people about their state of consciousness. This was not published in the paper because we really wanted to focus on the visuals, but you can also elicit altered states of consciousness with Ganzflicker. So people would respond to the question, if you felt a change in your state of consciousness, please describe how you felt in more detail. Some people would feel unaware of their body. Their feelings would change. Sometimes they said it felt like an LSD flashback. I felt a bit sleepy. I forgot I was in my own body. I feel more relaxed, things like that. So also pretty typical for altered states of consciousness. So those results were written up in a pop science article that got a lot of attention on the conversation. So it was actually the editor of the article who changed the title of my article, which was good because she made it into a test yourself here sort of article. So people would click on it to see if they could see hallucinations. They would fill out the questionnaire. And that ended up taking off pretty surprisingly. And we ended up getting about 7,000 new responses on the Ganzflicker questionnaire, which then turned into the next paper, which is kind of a replication of the first. And we found pretty much the same results, just stronger. It's a very robust effect. 200 people or 1,000 people or 7,000 people, it doesn't matter. You see pretty much similar things. So I'm going to present the results of the 7,000 person paper because they look nicer. So the first result I want to just point out is that we did seem to recruit quite a high number of people with aphantasia. Whether they came from the aphantasia network or the subreddit, I don't know. But we did seem to get quite a good distribution of people with aphantasia. They're shown in blue there. So I have the imagery vividness rating from 0 to 10 on the x-axis there. 0 means complete aphantasia, 10 means hyperphantasia, and then the density, the number of people who reported each rating. And so what you see for the aphantasia distribution is kind of 1/2 of a normal distribution, where most people say they have complete aphantasia and then it sort of drops off, which is what you expect among an aphantasia distribution. And then you have kind of a normal distribution of imagery, where most people tend to report their imagery a little bit more vivid than average. People just tend to do that. Not so many people at the most extreme end of imagery though. So the first result I wanted to point out, so this table is a bit messy, but I'm going to explain it. Again, imagery vividness is on the x-axis, 0 to 10 scale. And these gray bars represent the proportion of people who said they didn't see anything in the Ganzflicker for the whole experiment. So the only thing that you should really pay attention to here is the difference between the people who rated themselves absolute 0 and the whole rest of the spectrum. So if people said they had complete aphantasia, they only had about a 50-50 probability of seeing anything, even simple pseudo-hallucinations in Ganzflicker. Whereas if they had even just a little bit of imagery, rating of 1, they performed no differently from the whole rest of the imagery vividness spectrum. And there was about 88% probability across ratings from 1 to 10 in terms of people being able to see something. So then we looked at the results for how vivid people's pseudo-hallucinations were compared to their imagery vividness. So again, imagery vividness rating is on the x-axis, and then we asked people to rate whether their pseudo-hallucinations were weak or insubstantial, clear but not vivid, clear, moderately vivid, and very vivid, almost real. And you see sort of a nice linear correlation with a bump pretty much right where the people with moderate imagery start at an imagery rating of 4. So I highlighted the different distributions in different colors, so you can see that a little bit better, the distinction. So all the people with aphantasia are in green, all the people in gray have typical imagery, at least, moderate to vivid imagery. And basically what you see is that people with aphantasia tend to describe experiences as weak and insubstantial, and then people with typical imagery or hyperphantasia see more vivid pseudo-hallucinations. And that is a very strong correlation of about 0.4. And then in terms of complexity ratings, so we asked people to rate how complex their experiences were, from formless colors to geometric shapes, and then both colors and shapes, or any other kind of simple pattern. And then there were complex objects, complex environments, or both complex objects and environments. And this did not show such a linear correlation. There was a little bit of a linear correlation within the aphantasia distribution. As you can see, people started to see more combined simple pseudo-hallucinations, but it's really only at about a rating of 4 that people start experiencing complex objects and environments. And what we also did with the larger sample was we made word clouds of how people with aphantasia and imagery uniquely described their pseudo-hallucinations. So in the free text responses, we made word clouds, and people with aphantasia tended to describe their experiences as occasional, blinking, vague, slight, and people with imagery were much more likely to say, I saw complex things like forests, sky, animals, people, buildings. So in summary, we found extremely strong evidence that people with complete aphantasia are less prone to pseudo-hallucinations compared to people with any imagery, even just a little. And people with moderate to vivid imagery are much more likely to experience complex pseudo-hallucinations compared to people with no or low imagery. So we then decided maybe we can add pseudo-hallucinations to this sort of profile of hyperphantasia. But then I was thinking, if people with hyperphantasia have these sorts of symptoms or characteristics, then people with aphantasia should show a lack of all of these things, right? Like they should have no synesthesia, no schizophrenia symptoms, no pseudo-hallucinations. It makes sense. There should be a double dissociation if it relied on imagery to have these experiences. However, as my research showed, even people with very weak imagery have a very similar prevalence to seeing pseudo-hallucinations in Ganzflicker. And even people with absolute zero imagery, even 50% of them see something. So there's not that perfect dissociation. Also, if you know Carla Dance's research, she did some prevalence measures in people with aphantasia and found that they have a similar prevalence of synesthesia as a general population. So at least synesthesia prevalence does not seem to have much to do with imagery. And then even though these results have not been published, we haven't done a proper study on this yet. I did do a pilot study where I asked people with aphantasia and hyperphantasia to report whether they experienced any positive or negative schizophrenia symptoms. And there was no difference between positive or negative or any symptoms at all of schizophrenia. So people with aphantasia can experience pretty much everything that people with imagery can. And this seems confusing. If you go by this sort of dichotomous idea that you need imagery for these things, and therefore people with aphantasia shouldn't have these things. But I think it's a little more complex than that. I think that imagery is just one dimension of what might potentially explain these various symptoms of divergent perception. So here I'm going to describe my model in parts because it's a little bit complicated. So I think imagery forms just one dimension of a two-dimensional model, and I consider imagery to be a sort of mid-level interpretative prior, according to a predictive processing framework. If you're not familiar with predictive processing, there are different levels of priors. So there are low-level priors, that is top-down information about sensory information, sensory expectations, Gestalt principles. If you have strong low-level priors, then you might have synesthesia. If you have weak low-level priors, you might have delusions. High-level priors are more high-level than that. They're based on beliefs. So, for example, mistaking an illusion for reality, like that sound is a voice. And strong high-level priors can result in hallucinations. But these are just two ends of prior levels, and not so many predictive processing theories go into intermediate or mid-level priors. I know NLSEP has one paper on this, at least. But at least in terms of predicting who's going to experience divergent perception, I think we need an interpretative conscious level of priors in the middle, in which you can kind of interpret low-level and high-level information. And so I think imagery is a good candidate for this. It's conscious, and I think strong mid-level perceptual priors result in hyperphantasia. Weak mid-level perceptual priors result in aphantasia. And the sensory quality of divergent experiences critically depends on your ability to form a mental image. That's my hypothesis, working hypothesis. You can debate me afterwards if you want to talk about it more, but that's how I'm running with it now. I think that prior strength, or the strength of your top-down expectations, can kind of be thought of as an analog to different levels of illusions. So low-level priors, sensory priors are automatic. You can't control that you can see this triangle, you can't just turn it off. It's very low level. Whereas the mid-level interpretative sort of prior can lead to embellishments of seeing very realistic kinds of faces and noise, or maybe you see just a very simple face-like pattern. It's very interpretative. And then there's the highest level of illusions, which like the rubber hand illusion, where in some cases, people can be convinced that a rubber hand is their own. This is very strongly tied to high-level priors, not based on actual sensory information. So we have these different levels of priors that I think can contribute to different divergent experiences. So strong low-level priors can result in synesthetic associations. I consider any kind of sensory prior a low-level prior. Mid-level priors, strong mid-level priors can result in mental projection or profantation ability. It is voluntary, so it's interpretative, it's under some amount of control. And then high-level, very strong high-level priors can contribute to complex hallucinations in different conditions. So, as I said before, I consider strength of mid-level priors to be one dimension. I don't put low-level and high-level priors onto different dimensions in this model. And the reason for that is because I think that both low-level and high-level priors can be explained by the second dimension of my model, which is sensory precision. So we know that perception is not just top-down, it's also bottom-up. And so in predictive processing, sensory precision is the confidence that you have in sensory information that is coming to you. People with low sensory precision, they're not putting a lot of stock into the real world. They are more likely to have high-level priors for this, strong high-level priors for this reason, going to contribute to an experience of hallucinations or reality discrimination issues, because you are not relying on that sensory information as feedback. Someone with high sensory precision should show strong low-level priors because they do rely on perceptual information to update their prior, their prediction errors. So strong low-level priors should be correlated with high sensory precision. And in that case, I think that strong high-level priors and low-level priors can be explained by sensory precision in that way. So instead of a model that's all mixed up with high-level priors on one side and low-level priors on the other, we can just condense that to strength of mid-level priors on one axis and sensory precision on the other. And that will lead to predictable divergent experiences depending on your mental imagery abilities and your confidence in sensory information. So hyperphantasia and aphantasia, again, are extremes of the mid-level prior strength dimension. Here we have them there. And then for sensory precision, people with low sensory precision are more likely to have schizophrenia characteristics. People with hyperphantasia will be more likely to experience sensory symptoms, such as hallucinations. People with aphantasia will be more likely to experience non-sensory symptoms, such as illusions. And then people with strong sensory precision, whether they have aphantasia or hyperphantasia, they'll be more likely to experience synesthesia if they have a divergent experience. And potentially, people with hyperphantasia might be more likely to be projectors than associators. So there's two different types of synesthesia. You can see it as a mental projection in the real world, or it might just be a strong association. In which case, I think the associator type is more likely to happen if you don't have imagery. So that's the model here. I don't have any predictions about the non-extreme zone. So for the rest of my talk, I'm going to discuss my predictions for what people at these different extremes are going to experience. And like I said before, I think that we could use this model to predict not only actual hallucinations or pathological divergent experiences in clinical populations, but we can also push people from the general population to experience anomalous things that are analogous to clinical divergent experiences, like hallucinations versus pseudo-hallucinations. It's a very general sort of model. So just to preface, before I go into the predictions for my pseudo-hallucination research, I just want to distinguish between pathological hallucinations and pseudo-hallucinations. There is an obvious difference. So clinically, when people experience hallucinations, they are completely uncontrollable. They're usually confused with reality. They are long-term or chronic, or they come and go throughout the lifespan. And in that case, all of these things can result in a negative impact on quality of life. Whereas with pseudo-hallucinations, they are perfectly controllable. As soon as you take off the hypnobucket, you stop seeing things. They're easily distinguished from reality. So even the most intense experiences that you have, you know that it's not actually in front of you. It's short-term and transient. You don't get Ganzflicker flashbacks after you take off the hypnobucket. And in that case, there's no effect on quality of life. So I want to make this distinction because I am not saying that hallucinations and pseudo-hallucinations are the same. I think that similar mechanisms may contribute to both, and we might be able to better understand real hallucinations by using pseudo-hallucinations as a simulation. But just because someone experiences pseudo-hallucinations, it doesn't mean they're going to have actual hallucinations. They are different. So in terms of behavioral predictions, so I was really interested in trying to figure out why people seem to have these different susceptibilities to simple and complex pseudo-hallucinations if they had imagery versus aphantasia. So most people with imagery see simple pseudo-hallucinations. About a third of those also see complex pseudo-hallucinations, whereas people with aphantasia are about 50% likely to see simple and only about 3% likely to see complex. So a very big difference in propensity, but I think that using the model that I just described, we can explain why people show these differences behaviorally. So first I have to go into the difference between simple and complex pseudo-hallucinations. So here's some examples of simple hallucinations. So these, if you look at them, they seem pretty stereotyped, most condensed visual information in the middle, less information in the periphery. A lot of this could be explained by veins in the eyes or different, the physical visual system. So simple hallucinations can have a very mundane sort of explanation that is constrained by the visual system. Whereas complex pseudo-hallucinations are a lot different. They don't seem to have any physical basis. You don't have any neurons that form a column that is shaped like a fire truck, for example. So we can't just explain that in a simple or low-level way. I actually think that simple pseudo-hallucinations are somewhat analogous to simple visual illusions, like the Knizia triangles that I showed you before. They're very stereotyped, they're pretty predictable, and complex pseudo-hallucinations are more like embellishments by imagery or mid-level priors. There might also be some high-level priors involved, where people start to dissolve the real world in favor of these more embellished images. So I have some predictions about who in my model will see simple pseudo-hallucinations. So I have two graphs I'm going to show you, one for simple pseudo-hallucinations, one for complex. So for simple pseudo-hallucinations, I think these are very highly related to low-level priors. So if you have strong low-level priors, you're more likely to see simple pseudo-hallucinations, similar to these visual illusions. You're going to be more prone to these low-level visual illusions. So I have color-coded in green the people with low probability of experiencing simple pseudo-hallucinations because they have low sensory precision. People with high sensory precision have at least a medium probability of experiencing simple pseudo-hallucinations. And if you have imagery, that can only be boosted, the sensory quality of your experiences. So that's why I have the highest probability of seeing simple pseudo-hallucinations for people who have hyperphantasia and synesthesia symptoms or characteristics, and a very low probability of such simple pseudo-hallucinations among people with schizophrenia symptoms generally, whether they have imagery or not. Whereas for complex pseudo-hallucinations, those require strong high-level priors to see the most complex information. However, this is also, as I said before, embellished by imagery, I believe. So everybody has the propensity to see simple pseudo-hallucinations. Whether that turns into complex is a matter of interpretation. So these interpretative mid-level priors that I talked about before. So if you have the ability to embellish simple information with imagery, additional sensory qualities from imagery, then you're going to be more likely to experience these complex pseudo-hallucinations. So people with aphantasia generally will be not prone at all to see these complex pseudo-hallucinations. People with mid-level moderate imagery will have a medium probability. And then if you have also low sensory precision, that sort of boosts this effect from imagery from top-down sources. You're not relying as much on what is actually happening in your visual system. So you'll be the most prone to complex pseudo-hallucinations if you have hyperphantasia and schizophrenia characteristics. So those are my predictions for complex and simple pseudo-hallucinations. And we can simplify that because I really only have the strongest predictions for these four corners of the model. And you can turn it into a table where you can sort of predict the different kinds of hallucinations that people will see. So if someone with aphantasia and schizophrenia symptoms will have a very low probability of seeing anything at all. And that's why we see this 50-50 propensity among people with aphantasia. People with aphantasia and synesthesia will have some medium probability to see simple pseudo-hallucinations. People with hyperphantasia and schizophrenia symptoms will be most likely to see complex, and then people with hyperphantasia and synesthesia will be most likely to see simple pseudo-hallucinations with those strong low-level priors. So those are my behavioral predictions. Those have not been tested yet. Now I'm going to show you my neural predictions, which I want to test with EEG. So this is Ganzflicker, flickering at 7.5 hertz. That means that there are 15 flips, 7.5 cycles in 1 second of the red and black, and this can be expressed as a sine wave. So that is the Ganzflicker frequency expressed as a sine wave here. Here's the visual cortex. We'll come back to the Ganzflicker later. So some previous research has found that the visual cortex does seem to sample visual information in the environment in the range of about 8 to 12 hertz alpha. And others have found that if you are watching an illusion, so watching whether you see these 2 dots going clockwise or counterclockwise, your visual alpha amplitude will be lower as you are experiencing or just before you are experiencing these illusions. Whereas if the illusion changes or doesn't change anymore or disappears completely, then your visual alpha amplitude gets stronger. So it is just one study that found this, but it is possible that alpha amplitude could serve as a marker of illusory experience. So when you're experiencing illusions, you have this lower amplitude alpha, no illusions, higher amplitude alpha. I think that when people are experiencing simple pseudo-hallucinations in Ganzflicker, they are going to show a similar pattern. So their alpha amplitude is going to become lower, more in line with the Ganzflicker frequency, but then also corresponding to the experience of these simple pseudo-hallucinations. However, with complex experiences, it's a little bit different. I think there are 2 things that need to occur in order for people to see complex pseudo-hallucinations. So first, I think that, as I said before, complex hallucinations or complex pseudo-hallucinations really require more reliance on high-level priors than low-level priors. It's all about embellishment from top-down sources. You're not as affected by sensory information. So what I think is going to happen in this case is that visual alpha is actually going to ramp up again as people start to experience more complex pseudo-hallucinations. People will start to filter out the Ganzflicker. They often anecdotally report that they don't see the flicker anymore when they start to experience these complex things. That should be something that we can measure in visual cortex. And then also, I think prefrontal regions are involved in complex pseudo-hallucinations. So when people start to experience these complex visuals, then the prefrontal and visual coherence is going to become stronger in the EEG signal. So according to this hypothesis, we can sort of fill out the 4 corners of the model. So here we have people with synesthesia who have these strong low-level priors on the right. They're going to show these simple effects and visual entrainment. They're going to be strongly affected by the Ganzflicker. Whereas someone with hyperphantasia and schizophrenia symptoms or characteristics who start to filter out the Ganzflicker will start to show less of an effect in visual cortex, but stronger coherence with prefrontal cortex in order to have these complex experiences. And then people with aphantasia and non-sensory schizophrenia symptoms won't show any of that. They won't be as affected by top-down or bottom-up sources, and they won't see anything. So that's the model. That's my talk. So thank you very much for having me.